Alrighty, so we're just hitting 12:30, so we're going to go ahead and start. Howdy y'all, thank y'all for coming over to the panel today. This is Fixing What You Broke on Your First At-Home Arcade Cabinet, a DIY primer for new to the hobby arcade cabinet owners. If you're already experienced, if you already own a lot of cabinets, you may not get a lot out of this. I did run this panel last year as well. It's very basic, very baseline sort of information to get you ready for whatever cabinet you did buy the day when it breaks, because it is going to break. Welcome in. Let me see my notes on here. Fixing anything. My focus today is hopefully to give you the mental tools and planning to fix just about anything that could go wrong on your first, second, or 50th arcade cab down the road. So, I'm your host for this panel. Patrick Pringles Taylor is one of the pseudonyms I go by. Nerd by day, nerd by night, and working IT pays the bills, but I've been working on people's arcade cabinets for well over 2 decades now. Starting out with minor fixes, just like replacing buttons and joysticks, to going as far as tracking down assembly errors from the factory on cabinets that were causing just an absolute storm of problems, and helping people retime mechanical components in really old school machines like some pinball cabinets, or pinball tables. So, for after the panel, I will have a QR code available if anyone would like to re-download it. Some people have had issues. I've tried to fix it. Hopefully it is fixed. But you can feel free to ask me things specific to your circumstances. This is going to be very high level, not talking specifically about like midway machines or claw machines or anything. But if you guys do have specific questions about stuff you've got going on at home, feel free to ask me after the panel. And as well, if you do download this and you want to do something with it later on, translate it, use it somewhere else, feel free. So, you broke your first arcade cabinet. You screwed up, you know what you did was wrong, or maybe you didn't know. But the question is, how are you going to make things right? Of the dozens of at-home cabs I've encountered, something is always at least a little wrong with them. It just comes with the territory. There are varying degrees of broke to things, some just being mundane issues like a light behind a logo being out, but others can really put a damper on things. Just the game that won't boot at all, or the sound effects sounding like they're underwater. Whether these were your fault or not, it's okay. If you want to fix them, I want to help you make it right. So, let's fix it. Simpler to say than to do, but we're going to go through these steps so you can enjoy getting back to your cab. We're going to talk about understanding what you've got, we're going to diagnose the problem, assemble a toolkit, and repair, replace, and retest. So, first step, know what you've got, aka fantastic cabinets and where to find them. The first step in trying to fix a thing is knowing what the thing is that you're trying to fix and what you've got to do to fix it. So you've got to gather information, write some things down, and understand things. So, a little bit of a story time. I had a buddy a while back who called me up for some assistance with an issue he was having with his Mortal Kombat 3 cab. He said that on the player 1 side, the buttons felt spongy and wrong. So he'd hit them and it would feel like it would work, but it was like sitting past into the button. They worked, but he was afraid something was just going on underneath it, especially on such an old cabinet, and I told him I'd come take a look and let him know what's going on. So, buttons don't usually feel that way when they go out. They just stop working when the material inside them just, that completes the circuit gets worn away. But maybe they had some gunk in them that needed cleaning, or maybe the springs that were in it had something going on with them. But that ended up not being the case. So anyone who owns an early Atari Midway cab may know this already, but it used to be pretty common for arcade operators to buy kits for their existing machines to convert them to newer versions of that same game, or entirely different games altogether. Neo Geo and Capcom were infamous for this, and even encouraged it with cartridges of some of their arcade cabinets, akin to much larger, more complicated than home consoles. Swapping out the hardware inside a cabinet can be pretty easy to do, but sometimes upgrades and game changes require way more. Changes the decals, signs, increased cost per play to offset the cost, and sometimes even major component upgrades like the monitor and input methods. So I arrive at his place and we exchange our pleasantries. He shows me the cab and I take a look at it, and I can tell this is a conversion. The graphics on the side had a totally different game on it. The monitor was smaller than a regular MK3 cabinet had, and the buttons are in the wrong places. He didn't realize any of this was suspect when he bought it from Facebook Marketplace a few months prior from a guy who had it in his basement and knew nothing about it beyond that it just ran MK3. A game he had only really played on consoles before owning that cab. Normally the control panel / button board looks like an X shape with a single extra button for run. People who converted up from an MK2 cabinet would have to buy the new control panel graphic and would receive a template for where to drill and add this button and how to hook it up. Others usually would have to order a totally new board, as the X pattern wasn't very common for fighting games. What was common for a lot of games, however, was 4 to 6 buttons to the right of the joystick. So sometimes folks would just buy a graphic that fits their existing button layout and then drill that extra hole, or just plug another hole, or just plug another button in to where the board wants the run button plugged in. My friend's MK3 cabinet was more akin to this, with a 6-button layout and an added run button. So knowing things weren't right for how they should be, I decided that taking a look under the button board was going to be step number 1, and actually trying to understand what was going on. And that piece of wood was drilled out like Swiss cheese. Getting in under it, they had all these little holes. They were all button-shaped holes that were just in all these seemingly random spots. So probably at some point in time, the previous owner, or the previous owner to the previous owner, or so on and so forth, had used it for other things. And as he needed to change button configurations, he just added more holes. But yeah, the graphic and plastic protector on top was covering up a ton of holes that someone else had drilled at some point for other configurations. When he was reporting that the buttons were feeling spongy and wrong, what he was actually feeling was the wood flexing from the wood cracking and breaking over time from being drilled out so much. Maybe the plastic protector was the only thing holding it on. But in the end, we replaced the entire piece with the replica from eBay, and things were back to how they should be. eBay's a great resource for arcade parts, I can tell you for sure. There's so many times where I've needed something like just a button board for a cabinet, and I've just been able to go on eBay and get the whole thing. People also make fantastic reproductions and then sell them on eBay as well. So instead of having to get one completely out of wood, when I was researching this last year, there's a company that actually makes metal button boards, because this wood issue is actually very common, that people swap in on their cabinets. So, sorry if it's hard to view, but I wanted to keep the animations intact for others, so I'd suggest, okay, never mind, I'm reading my own notes for something else. So what we learned from previous stories is that sometimes machines can have a complicated history that can drastically affect the repairs you'll need to do. One thing I stress to people is to always know what it is that you've got. What type of machine do you have? Do you know the manufacturer of that cabinet? Has it been modified, like my friend's MK3 cab was? And what version of the software is it running? So these are kind of the important things to know whenever you're getting a cabinet for the first time, for the second time, 50th time. Just you want to know the history and you want to know what's going on with it. My friend never reported issues before this on his cabinet, but if he knew what the machine was supposed to look like, he could have let me know that the side graphics were wrong, an existing issue, which might have helped before I arrived. In your case, if you're encountering a new issue, take stock and think about what other issues you've currently got going on. Was anything else loose? Does it have odd behavior with something? Or did you buy it with stuff already broken? And if possible, know machine's history when you're buying it used. This can also help with anticipating issues or maintenance the machine may need in the upcoming future. One that's been primarily private owned for a long time by a dedicated collector probably won't have hidden issues, but one that was a moneymaker at a small time like arcade or bar before being passed along to several other people's for their kids to play might not be in the greatest condition and may need fixing sooner than later. As someone who has dealt primarily with that latter part of it, with people in the Gulf South buying arcade cabinets from bars that are going out of business or bars that are just getting rid of them over time because people stop playing them, you find a lot of alcohol under things, a lot of sticky alcohol. So kind of knowing that, if whenever people buy those types of cabinets, I say get in there and clean up whatever's in there, because there's going to be something in there. They are not cleaning them out. So after collecting information about the machine itself, there's some meta things to know. What tools do you have? You may not need them all, or maybe even if what's wrong, but it's good to have everything in one place if it isn't already, and take an inventory to know the names of things. Because if a manual or guide online is telling you that you need a long, insulated number 2 Phillips head screwdriver for removing something, you don't want to say, yeah, I've got a screwdriver, and then you find out you have a uninsulated number 1 Quadrex that'll slip out of the screw head and strip it. So between apps like Google Lens and ChatGPT and the internet, it can be easy to figure out what it is that you have on hand if you're not someone who's just inherently a tool person. And speaking of finding things out online, you should be aware of where information for your machine might be found at. It's easy enough to Google things, but sometimes the information you'll need may be a little bit more niche. So you can explore communities like Discord servers or forums if they exist for your machine, as often someone in there has encountered a similar problem to yours. And Likewise, those communities or online may have manuals for your machine if you're missing any, including service manuals that may be able to tell you things like wiring diagrams and voltages, just so you can take a look at them at a glance without trying to measure them and make sure that that's correct. Favorite what you'll need for repair for easy access. A great case of this, there was an old website called Pump Haven that was popular for the Pump It Up community. And on there, as they would get new mixes released for Pump It Up, and this was like the pre-Facebook era, a lot of at-home owners would still post the manuals and post the books that they would get with those new releases when they bought them. And they helped out a lot of people, because now people will get those same cabinets on the older versions, not know how to go into diag mode and other stuff, and a quick search, and they find all that information real easy. And while you're building that list of your favorites, consider making a cabinet journal. It's a notebook with photos, with notes, photos, information about the machine, changes and mods to it, receipts and more that can help you and future owners and repair technicians when fixing things. So instead of digging up where you ordered a part last time something went out, if you recorded that information, you have a part number in your cab journal, you can have it ready for the next time. Usually whenever I fix something, usually I get these little tiny black composition style notebooks from Office Depot. I just write whatever the cabinet is, who owns it, information about it on page 1. The next page is just, hey, it was this date, here's what I did, here's what I swapped out with. And I encourage people, when you get a cabinet, do the same thing and just leave it inside the cabinet somewhere. That way, again, if it's me or someone else going in and fixing something, we can just flip through that and see what's already been done and what's already been replaced on it. And that was everything we just talked about right there. So, now that we're armed with a little bit of the knowledge and a little bit of a primer, let's go ahead and think about diagnosing the problem. Even though sometimes this is the longest step in the process, sometimes it's like trying to 100% a Metroidvania with stupid hidden upgrades and blocks. So, the diagnostic process. So the longest step, honestly, is the first step, which is taking photos and videos of things. And when I say you take photos and videos, take photos and videos, the entire step, the entire way. On your phone with a camera, if you have a dedicated camera, if you have a camcorder, if you have a GoPro, any of that helps. It really does. There's been so many times where I've taken photos of things beforehand, did what I needed to do, something didn't work, and just by looking back at my own photos, I realized, oh, I've got this connector plugged into the wrong spot, swapped it around, problem's gone away. Those photos have saved me hours and hours and hours, and same with videos. They're not just useful for you, they're also useful for people online. Because again, as we talked about with communities, if you're having an issue, someone else has probably had the issue, and you're going to know they had the issue because they took a bunch of photos and videos and posted it on a forum online. So it can be helpful if you're having that same issue to share that same information online. So if you've got a case of a light gun that won't shoot accurately, won't shoot straight, or when you twist it a certain way, all of a sudden it stops working completely, take a video. Just set up your camera, take a video, post it online, talk about it on a forum. Whether you fix it or not, that's more information for you or someone else down the road to use. So it can always be helpful, and especially on some machines where they're very computer driven and you get error codes that pop up. Those error codes usually have some sort of meaning, and usually it's easier to find them online, and you can just look on your phone and say, all right, that's the code, cool, type it right in, instead of going between your arcade room and your computer or bringing your laptop in there and then doing the search on the floor. Photos, just photos, photos, photos. I can't stress that enough. That being said, I always trust the scientific process. State your problem / ask a question, whatever the issue is from your perspective, basically. Research what's occurring. Has anyone else had this issue? Form a hypothesis about what might be causing the issue based on what you know. Collect information and experiment to see if your hypothesis might be right. Interpret that data you've gathered from observation or experimentation, and then draw a conclusion about the next steps to take. And something else to remember during the diagnostic process is that everything in a cabinet is part of one system ultimately. Everything is connected up one way or another. The light on top uses the same power supply, uses the same power supply down the line as the screen and the computer board. A single button not working can sometimes be a symptom of a much bigger issue downstream from that button. But also keep things simple. Occam's razor is a diagnostic adage that tells us that the simplest explanation is usually the most likely one. The game that won't make a sound, it's probably something unplugged or a setting turned off. Start there before you search much deeper with your hypothesis. Just keep it simple at first and go from there. So let's do an example based on that. So you own a Pump It Up CX cabinet. Your player 1 upper left arrow isn't registering how it used to. How do you diagnose? So naturally, we start with photos. As goofy as it sounds, take photos of the dance platform, take photos of the outside of the cabinet, take photos of the umbilical connector between the two, take photos of the back of the cabinet. But before we start taking anything off or changing anything, we're going to take videos. In this case, since the issue is occurring with a specific part during gameplay, we're going to play a couple songs that we know use that arrow a bunch, and then we're going to record the screen and the dance platform separately if necessary. And after that, we'll power down the machine and take everything off the back and take photos in every specific section and take photos of every specific connector. This is our baseline, so we know what is normal to go off of and how to return things when we fix them. So we're going to want to take photos of everything as well. We'll take off the covers for the umbilical cable to take photos of it, take off the central middle panel on the dance platform and take photos, and then take off the arrow itself, and again, take more photos. So moving on to the scientific process, we're stating our problem. The player 1 upper right arrow doesn't register consistently. Research. Let's check online to see if others have had this issue. And they have. They usually replace the sensor to resolve it. So our hypothesis, one of our sensors is probably going out. Let's collect some data and experiment by pressing on the arrow where each of the sensors is to determine if one of them is less responsive than the other. Thankfully, in our research phase, we learned that this Pump It Up arcade cabinets are supposed to have an I/O test mode for this. And the manual confirms it too. From the data gathered, it seems like the rightmost sensor is less responsive than the others. So conclusion, it probably needs to be replaced. But before we order a replacement, let's think about this for a second. Everything is a system. Let's double check that other things aren't wrong first. We'll follow from the start of the process to the end. So the sensor is depressed by the panel above when it's stepped on. Is the panel totally flat? Well, it seems like it is, so we'll move on. The sensor is also bracket where it's installed, so let's check that that's intact. Seems like it is. Going from there, the sensors all have connectors. Let's make sure they're fully plugged, and they are. Everything seems fine so far, honestly. Let's stick to only the most obvious things for now, though. We've eliminated a fair amount of other possibilities and forehead slappers to just replace that sensor. So we've gotten a lot out the way, so let's just replace the sensor. They're affordable, and they'll go out over time anyway. They're a maintenance item, and if it doesn't resolve our issue, we'll start back at square one and see what we can research and experiment to do next. So that's an example of how you would put it into practice for fixing something like this. So now that we've done some experiments and observations and we've thought about how to fix a problem, let's get into a little bit more about toolkits. So now that we've got the information, let's get physically ready. And hopefully have everything in one spot as well. So generally your tools are going to be either hardware tools, like screwdrivers and wrenches and voltage meters, or software tools like a laptop and a USB drive. On the hardware side, here are some things to know and remember. The difference between SAE and metric. SAE is the American measurement of things. Screws may be in measurements like a number 2 for the head, and bolts may be in stuff like 3/4 of an inch. Conversely, metric is metric. Stuff is usually measured in millimeters, sometimes centimeters, but usually bolts will be measured something like M6 x 5.5, which means it's a 6 millimeter head by 5.5 millimeters in length. And then if you do need to buy tools, expensive tools are great if you're repeatedly using them very often, traveling with them a lot, need them to last a long time. But honestly, you don't always need expensive tools. You can go to Walmart, you can use Hyper Tough tools, you can go to Harbor Freight, you can get Pittsburgh or Hercules or some of the lesser brands. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, some more specific tools and brands, but for the most part, honestly, you can get away with, if you're just a hobbyist, getting whatever works for you within your price range. And so anytime you're trying to do something like undoing a screw or bolt, try a hand tool first. You're far less likely to break something permanently tightening or loosening it by hand. But if you got to use things like a little bit of a power tool, a little bit of a from one to get things off. That said, use tools, hands, and power for what they're meant to. Flathead screwdrivers are not pry bars. That's how you break them. And I have broken several of them before I decided to just get actual pry bars. They make them in all sorts of sizes. Even if you think, oh, I just want one that's a little, they make them that size. They know. But yeah, use the right tool for the task. A lot of the times, especially when I'm working on other people's stuff, I don't want to break it. I don't want to mar it. Like, there's so many times where I've used the flathead screwdriver to pry something open and just ended up chipping away a bunch of wood around it when an actual proper plastic pry bar wouldn't have. And also, using the right tools means respecting electricity. If you've got to test electrical components, try to know what voltage and amperage you're expecting ahead of time and take safety measures for it. And similarly, anything you're plugging or unplugging, take care to touch nothing else when you're doing that. Also, lastly, get a real flashlight. Don't use your phone. Real flashlights throw a much better light, they last longer on a charge, and it leaves your phone free for photos and reference and for you to pull things up, watch a YouTube video. It's hard to juggle your phone, watching YouTube and using it for a flashlight at the same time you're trying to get around to a specific tech. No, just get a real flashlight. They sell headband ones. They sell ones that can sit on a floor and shine in. There's a million ones. Get a real flashlight. But we're going to talk about the software side of things. Tablets are fantastic and make a great way to view a lot of those things, like the videos and manuals and forum posts and etc. We should keep our phone free, but we should still use a larger screen when possible, especially a lot of cabinets I've been in. Sometimes they have space for a tablet, but ultimately, if I need to be in something and then duck back out afterwards to take a look at something, having a larger screen is much easier than having something like a phone to look at. And on top of that, they're still pretty portable. They're more portable than a laptop, and there's a little bit less setup to it. You just hit a button, and it's right back to where you are, versus a laptop. You turn it on, you sign in, go from there. But yeah, so it keeps your phone free for everything. Bigger screens are easier to read. And as well, tablets are cheap. If you know someone who has like an old iPad 2 that they never use, you can still go on the web, you can still download a PDF, and it'll still be good for that. And that way, if you do break it or something else, it's not really that big a deal. And speaking of older stuff, never underestimate older software and devices. If your cabinet is running a older PC hardware and boots off regular PC hard drive, usually they picked that combination of things for a reason. They expected it to be hardy and easy to work on for long periods of time as a business device, so don't just think it'll just have problems or it just won't handle things just because it's old. There's been so many machines here especially where their age is very evident from the outside, but some of those machines have never been touched electronically inside because electronics are still going on. So don't always assume that it's just the software's messed up or the hardware's messed up just because it's old. And relating to older hardware, if you're not a hacker, don't play around. I think that should say with unofficial software. Okay, never mind. They usually include a lot of security on the chips and hard drives and memory cards on the machines themselves. So this is official software. So unless you're specifically wanting to invalidate your card that has your specific arcade game on it, don't try to just pop it in your machine and think you're going to hack it and do a bunch of other stuff to it. But a lot of them have safety measures on it, and they can be made worse just by even plugging it into a computer. And that can make some of your problems even worse if that's what you're trying to fix. If a program you got for your cabinet requires you to plug a drive in and modify the software to repair, be careful to make sure you understand what you're modifying and only modifying what you need to. And as for those programs you get from online, only get them from sources you can trust. While it's not super likely massive hacker groups are targeting owners of initial D cabinets from the early 2000s in their Discord, it's still possible software shared from them or others could have been infected on their computer or just being uploaded somewhere. And the download service you're signing up for might actually be stealing your personal information. So as always, use a bit of common sense and context when trying to determine the safety of the things you're browsing around and downloading. And when in doubt, you can always just use a fresh operating system on a computer not connected to a network to run a tool that you need. It's a common tactic called air gapping, as it is. So if you got something weird online and you just want to try it out on something that's not going to steal any other hardware and not break something that you're concerned about keeping going. So by request, some folks asked me last year when I ran this to suggest what to have in a toolkit for fixing most things you'd encounter on most arcade cabinets. Again, there's a million different arcade cabinets out there. You can go downstairs and see the million of them out there. But these are going to be some of the most common tools that you're going to want to have no matter what kind of cabinet it is you have fixing things. So I'm not going to say to go out and buy all of these right now or that you need any of these specific brands. But this is just for people who wanted to get an idea of, all right, well, if I do want to do this, like what kind of stuff am I going to want? So first off, and the only part, is going to be hardware. A precision screwdriver kit is usually the first thing I recommend for people who are getting into the hobby. They're useful for small screws that you'll find holding down connectors, electronic parts, and some of the trim. Hypertough and iFixit are some of the brands I like. Hypertough is available at Walmart any time of day, easy to grab the same day you need it. And iFixit is a little bit more upscale and will likely last a bit longer. iFixit especially, I've noticed that the bits are a little bit harder steel than Hypertough especially. I've bent some of the Hypertough flatheads, but this Hypertough specific toolkit from online at Walmart is $8. So I can afford to bend a flathead or two and just replace it. But I don't think I'd be bending the iFixit ones at all. So hand tools. If you want to get a whole set at home, then I'd suggest getting a household toolkit, not a mechanics toolkit. The difference there is household toolkits tend to have hammers and pliers and scissors and other things. Mechanics toolkit, you're going to get every single size of metric wrench under the sun, whether you need it or not, and they're usually in sizes that arcade cabinets don't use, like 21 millimeters and 18 millimeters. Some cabinets do use those, but it's better to just buy those as you need them. So otherwise, if you want to do it piece by piece, selections that I would say, get some larger screwdrivers, especially a number 2 Phillips head for larger screws, a good flathead or slot head screwdriver, some needle nose pliers, some slip joint pliers, a small hammer, utility razor, a measuring tape, end wrenches, and a socket wrench. Scissors are okay, but diagonal cutters are better for, along with some heavy duty clippers for getting rid of like little plastic ties that are in there or snipping wires if you absolutely have to. And you'll use these for stuff like larger screws, bolts, and fasteners. Stuff that holds the cabinet together is where you're going to use a lot of these hand tools versus taking out like a motherboard or unscrewing a bracket that's holding in a graphics card. So shown are the Cobalt and Husky brands, more big box tool brands. Brand matters a little bit less here unless you're looking to buy specifically for long-term quality again. And if you are, buy higher individual pieces and buy higher tier brands, Klein Tools, Crescent, DeWalt, Craftsman. Again, if you're looking specifically for upscale, you probably know a little bit about tools to begin with, so get the brand you like. Next up, a multimeter. And that's probably one of my most used tools besides a screwdriver for arcade cabinet repair. They can be used to make sure parts that should be receiving power are, and what amount and type of power they're receiving. And I would encourage you guys to YouTube a quick video on how to use one before you get one, because it can be dangerous to accidentally probe the wrong things. So read the manual when you get it, make sure you know how to use it. Multimeters can be used to also detect continuity. And continuity is just making sure that the ends of 2 connectors are properly connected, there's not a break in between, there's not some sort of other smart independent technology in between. So you can make sure that this wire, the start and the end, are on the same circuit. Depicted are Klein and Fluke brands. Both are upscale brands, but this is a spot where you don't want to cheap out. A good multimeter won't just be accurate and give you data faster, it'll protect your life. And accidentally touching the wrong wires, especially if it's still plugged in, which you should have unplugged it probably a while ago. Well, I guess you can if you're doing electrical testing, but they can protect you. Getting 120 volts across your fingers is not fun. I've done it. I'm still here, so I'm still alive, but it's not fun. Good multimeters can help protect you against that. It's better to just lose $120 on a multimeter than to have several $1,000s in a hospital bill. So you can go cheaper if you really want, but I'm always going to tell you to get something more expensive. The Klein Tools that's pictured here, I think it's about $60 to $80 online these days. Again, it's a lot, but I would trust that to not kill me accidentally or protect me if I'm dumb. So power tools, specifically a drill and driver. A common and fast way to take out screws and bolts and drill a hole where necessary. You may need some other tools down the road, such as a saw for cutting wood or plastic, an impact wrench for torquing down bolts that take a lot of stress. If you do racing machines, typically you're going to have a big bolt in the middle of your racing wheel that you need to torque down to a specific torque spec as well. Power cutting tools like a grinder or oscillating tool. But first and foremost, get a drill and a driver if you don't already have one. The ones shown are going to be circumstantial. It's just the Ryobi and DeWalt brands. They're both fine big box brands. Just keep in mind batteries usually only work within the brand you buy. So if you get a Ryobi drill, but a DeWalt impact wrench later, just because it was on sale, you'll have 2 different battery systems to keep track of. But honestly, if you can, stay within the same brand. It just makes life easier. So next up is gloves. Didn't have any images for this because I don't have any solid brands to recommend. There's reusable gloves, and then there's black nitrile mechanics gloves that you can get from most hardware stores. Again, just like with the multimeter, gloves can protect you. They can be insulated. They can make sure if you're grabbing the wrong thing that you're going to be able to release it just fine. And as well, they give you grip to get onto things a lot better. There's a lot of connectors that I've accidentally broken just using pliers to pull it out, but I go back in with gloves and I'm able to remove it just fine. So those are good. It's just your preference if you want reusable or if you want the disposable, but the reusable are going to protect you a little bit better than the disposable ones are, but either way, it'll keep your hands clean. And lastly, again, and I cannot stress this, several flashlights, several real flashlights. A lot of these cabinets are very small. Some of the better ones, of course, it's just one big panel in the back. You take it off and you give it light and it's fine. But you get into more complicated machines, some claw machines and other things. You're going to need a light down below. You're going to need a light above. You may need a light above the above. So just get a few. They're relatively cheap. And again, get a few in different combinations of ways that they illuminate. So now that we have the knowledge and we have an idea of what's going wrong and we've talked about tools, we can talk about the repair, replace, and retest process. So no, it's just not hitting with a hammer. Won't deduct resources from your inventory and fix it. You've actually got to go in there and do something. But first, a relevant story. So I touched upon safely briefly when talking about tools. Now I want to emphasize it a little bit more with the scary experience of mine personally. If anyone spent time in the arcades at MAGFest, you'll know that there are a lot of older arcade cabinets that use a CRT, a cathode ray tube display, and they're big glass displays that you see in older TVs that are really, really heavy. They work by being a large glass tube that is basically completely vacuum sealed, which I know is a little bit long of a term, with one end far larger than the other, with the large end covered by individual phosphors that light up when hit by an electron that comes from an electron gun that's mounted at the back, the small end of the tube. The electron gun shoots out a stream of electrons that are steered using magnets just in front of the gun to strike the phosphors at the big end of the tube by scanning back and forth to refresh the phosphors, which are usually only glowing for a fraction of a second. As the electron gun scans back and forth, lighting up certain phosphors and not others, it makes the picture that we see. And if you add a red, green, and blue mask to the other side of the phosphors in a repeating order, you get a color display as the colors blend together by the time our eyes resolve what we're seeing. So in order to do this, most CRTs use incredibly high voltages for those electron guns. Some of them can be up to 1,000 volts per diagonal square inch, or per diagonal inch. The vacuum stored in these massive leaded tubes can also lead to immensely damaging explosions, implosions. There's different ways people want to call it, but they can have a very massive and sudden failure that can be very, very loud if the glass becomes compromised. And this is a story about both of those things being a risk. So I was helping some friends move some time back, and they had a few arcade cabinets that went along to the new house with them. After we got all the trucks unloaded and one of them was going to return the truck, they wanted me to go ahead and get the arcade cabinet set back up in the new arcade space they had in the house. Make sure nothing was broken. Simply enough, I got things reassembled and put back together and started to turn things on to check for life. Unfortunately, their large Neo Geo cab was having some issues, specifically with displaying things. It had no display at all. I did my usual diagnostics, took some photos to make sure I could put things back together right, listened and watched what happened when power came on. I could hear the static of the CRT display getting power, but no video. I unplugged the power and started to check some connections. Since CRTs carry such a massive voltage across them, and they're meant to be very conductive as part of how they work, they can hold a charge for a very long time. As I mentioned before, they can store potentially 1,000 volts per diagonal inch, and this was over 30 inches diagonally of screen. During the checking process, I accidentally tapped the back of the CRT glass and received a massive shock. I upped and leaned back and fell away from the cabinet, but still fell over very hard and knocked my head a little bit. My right arm was numb, and moving it was hard. My friends heard me and came to assist, and against the better judgment of everyone there, I did not go to the ER. I drank some water and waited it out, began to feeling began to get very painful within the next 15 to 20 minutes, but the feeling came back. I told them about the cabinet, and they said to just leave it alone, we'll troubleshoot it another day, and they gave me a lift home. Story doesn't end there, though. So the cabinet is still broken, and they still needed my help with it. Thankfully, they never plugged it back in, so a week later, I'm back at their house and back to looking around and things and swapping some parts around, taking them out of the machine to test them and see what was right or wrong about certain things and see if something was dead. And finally, came back to the monitor side of things. I had to test it. So I decided to probe and test the boards first for issues, but I couldn't find anything, so I decided to see if maybe last week's accident jump-started something. I plugged everything back in and I turned it on. Same issue, so we're back to square one. But this time, after unplugging the cabinet, I'm ready to discharge it before I continue anything to avoid a repeat. Usually for these types of displays, you need a special discharging tool to ground the charge, and then you pop off a suction-cupped wire with a flathead or similar. It's a process I've done plenty before replacing It's a process I've done plenty before when replacing CRT displays or working on them, so it's routine for me, but I'm taking some extra precautions because of the last time. I've got some nice insulated gloves on. I've got my head and body around the side of the cabinet while my gloved hand reaches in to do what it needs to do. Discharge was successful, and now I need to pop that suction cup off. I grab a flathead, assume the position as before around the side of the cabinet, and right as I get under the suction cup, and pow! There's a massive explosive sound, and I yank my head back like nobody's business and jump back from the cabinet just to see the front of the glass completely shattered outwards. My friends ran into the room from the noise from the CRT explosion or implosion, and my best guess, autopsy-wise, was the move had somehow compromised the glass from when I was actually popping that tag off, or popping the insulator off, or the suction cup off. So I probably hit something and probably ruined that CRT in the process. And usually color CRTs are way, way tougher than that. But I guess with all the extra weight from being that big, plus the stress of the move and the age of the glass, I'm assuming those were all factors. Nobody was hurt from the glass, but they were vacuuming glass for the next few weeks out of the carpet stall. In the end, we replaced the busted out CRT panel with an LCD one, because getting those larger 30-inch CRTs that fit in the Neo Geo is just next to impossible. And it still plays fine to today. So CRTs explode sometimes, although sometimes they don't. So yeah, don't take things too lightly when fixing some of your arcade cabinets. Fixing things is important, especially when it comes to things that are no longer made, but we've still got to be careful that we don't end up having to fix ourselves because of the other things we're fixing. Nobody was hurt, thankfully, from my friend's Neo Geo cab. Well, nobody was hurt permanently, I should say. I was hurt. Unfortunately, my arm is back to normal since then. It was normal by that night, but things could have easily been worse. So honestly, always exercise caution. Things don't always go wrong, but be prepared just in case. As you heard in the story, I used an insulated glove and took care to not be in the proverbial line of fire when discharging or disconnecting that CRT display. That's not my advice for CRTs. Others online have much better safety guides for you to follow, but always consider the bad sides of things and just make sure you're taking care of yourself. And one way you can prepare is by having a buddy. They're not just your lifeline in case something goes wrong, like my friends coming to investigate that loud sound, but two heads are better than one. And your buddy can also can help you with a lot of things that sometimes require more than two hands. Again, getting back to CRTs, they're heavy, they're big. Having two people is way better than just having one for replacing them. And one of my favorite things I get repair buddies to do is hold the flashlight. Because as many flashlights as you have, you still need a way to hold them. But as well, they can read things for you and help you out with a lot of things. So have a buddy, it just helps a lot. Also, don't finalize things too early. You can finger tighten things, you can just keep things out of the way in ways that aren't permanent, so you don't end up having to do the same work 4 to 5 times. But one thing you should do plenty of is always read and reread any guides and instructions you have. Reading them aloud can even help you more, and read them to your buddies. And maybe they can be like, hey, wait, that doesn't make sense, when you realize you've been skipping a line the whole time when reading a guide that tells you to disconnect something first. All right. And disconnecting things is important, as we learned. But yes, so respect electricity, never work on a live machine if you can help it. There's a concept called lockout tagout that is used in professional environments that's meant to prevent people from dying from people turning on or using machines or systems while technicians work on them. If your machine has a detachable power cable, remove it fully before working on it, put it in another room even. If it's mechanical and it has a locking pawl or lever, make sure it's firmly fixed in place and locked when possible. Ideally, nobody could or even Nobody could, even by force, use the cabinet while you're working on it, potentially out of view of you. So safety first, just take all measures. And just how they shouldn't be able to force things, you too should never force things into place. As previously mentioned, use the right tools for the right job, and that includes never forcing something in somewhere. Most things fit together pretty smoothly. If it feels forced, recheck yourself or your instructions, and never force yourself to complete a job you're completely in over your head with. Emotionally, mentally, physically, or in any other way. Take breaks, come back another time, get yourself some rest. Same thing that happened with me after that incident with the monitor. Took a little bit of time, came back, was able to get things ironed out. And chiefly, you can do the thing. So never force yourself, but always challenge yourself, always learn new skills, and fix what you broke, or what may have broken. We live in an age of often disposable and unfixable things. Part of the allure for me of arcade cabinets, especially the older ones, is they were built with repairability in mind. The tinkering and repair process itself is a lot of problem solving, and it's fun. I like doing that. I've learned a ton over the decades fixing up machines, and I continue to learn more and more. Some of it is super niche and specific to just certain machines or a type of machine, like I'm learning about pachinkos and pachi slots right now and how interchangeable they are. And other things I've learned are things that I use daily, like quickly converting SAE to metric in my head and knowing that, all right, well, 12.7 millimeters is about half an inch. And just knowing that right off the head if I need to convert something over. So I'm hoping y'all can learn to enjoy fixing things too, or at the very least find your way through the process and keep those beautiful machines alive for longer. And so, thank you guys for coming by. That's it. If you do want to try to download the panel, I have a QR code up there. And thank you guys for coming out to the panel today.